Cruise ships are supposed to be places of leisure and escape, but what if your trip becomes an unrecoverable nightmare? We examine 5 actual terror events at sea tonight, which have been meticulously re-examined from forums, Reddit, and survivor accounts. These terrifying stories, which actual passengers swear occurred on board, are not urban legends. Every detail, from non-existent cabins to whispers in the middle of the night, will make you wonder if you'd ever dare take another trip. Follow me through to the finish, and if these tales make you shiver, please hit the bell icon, subscribe to Midnight Outcry, and leave a comment below describing the experience that most frightened you. Let's turn down the lights and board now. Story 1. When I first saw the ship, I was struck by how unusually silent it was for a vessel transporting thousands of people. When I finally lugged my bag down the long carpeted hallway toward my cabin, the silence had already become like a second skin to me, even though I had boarded with the typical eagerness. No footsteps, no voices through the doors, muted, just the continuous, deep hum of the engines, like an untrustworthy heartbeat. I'm Aaron, and I didn't voluntarily sign up for this cruise. My sister had demanded it. She claimed that I needed a break from everything I had experienced over the previous 12 months. She pledged, a week at sea, no work, no distractions. It will benefit you. However, I was aware from the first night that this would not be a typical journey, 9 to 4-3 cabin. I owned that. The girl behind the desk at check-in gave me the key card after a brief pause. It was delicate, so subtle that if I hadn't already been on edge, I may have missed it. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine with a look of sympathy, but her hand stayed on the plastic card for a beat too long. The interior of the room appeared normal, with a porthole overlooking the infinite black sea, a little desk with a lamp and a small bed jammed against the wall. However, the air seemed stale, blood on coins, almost metallic. I recall having this unreasonable impulse to avoid going inside as I was standing in the doorway with my suitcase still in my hand. I had trouble sleeping that night. I swear I heard someone pacing the corridor every time I closed my eyes, dragging, slow steps. Then there was quiet. However, a few hours later, I heard 3 taps on my door and a slight knock. No one was present when I opened it. I'll take a brief break at this point since, if you've read this far in my novel, you should definitely subscribe to Midnight Outcry. These aren't simply stories, they're documents of actual experiences that have been verified and re-verified by those who claim to have lived through them. It only gets darker from here, so stay still. On the second day, I observed something odd. It seemed like there was nobody else in my hallway. There were numbers on every door I went by, but I never saw a passenger get out. I once put my ear to 9 to 42, the door next to mine. Quiet, too much quiet. As if the room were a shell, empty of anything. A crew member's face froze when I asked him at dinner if the hallway was simply underbooked. He mumbled something about overflow accommodations, and faked a smile that stopped short of his eyes before hurriedly leaving with the tray rattling in his hands. Things got out of hand on the third night. The hallway's pacing became louder and closer until it came to a halt directly outside my door. Through the opening at the bottom, I could make out the shadow of 2 still feet. They spent about an hour there. The corridor was deserted once more, as I plucked up the nerve to yank the door open. However, my rug was damp, as if someone had been standing on it and soaking. I recognized then that whatever was outside wasn't merely a fleeting thing. It desired entry, and that was just the start. My head was pounding when I woke up the morning following the episode with the soaking rug. My initial reaction was that it might have been a hallucination, a devious trick of fatigue. However, there was still a slight salt odor coming from the carpet fibers as I knelt down. Not water spilled, not perspiration. See, I was to be distracted by breakfast. When I entered the main dining room, there was a lot of noise and conversation, laughter reverberating off the chandeliers, forks striking plates. Perhaps, I reasoned, I could bury the discomfort in everyday life. However, paranoia has the tendency to follow you into the light. The woman across from me leaned in without saying hello when I sat down at a big table. Her eyes darted as if she were terrified of being overheard, and her middle-aged hair was pulled back in a tidy bun. "Are you not in 943? She muttered. Midway to my lips, my fork froze. "How are you aware of that?" She shook her head and squeezed her lips into a narrow line. "Just watch out at night. Don't answer if it knocks. A waiter walked by before I could inquire further, and she immediately clammed up. She quickly left the hall after pushing her plate aside and muttering something about not feeling hungry. I was shaken by it, and inquisitive. How was she aware of my cabin? Why had she forewarned me? I waited for the knock that night, which was probably the one thing I shouldn't have done. Around 2 in the morning, it began softly before becoming harder and more forceful. 3 taps. Hold on. Again. 3 taps. As I slipped toward the door, my chest constricted. I didn't throw it open this time. I lowered myself to eye level with the ground and looked at the shadow beneath the opening. This time, the feet were absent. However, there was movement. Slow. Methodical. Dragging fingers like across the carpet. 5 slender figures stretched across the light. I swear, the lamp on my desk flickered as I staggered back, my heart pounding. Just that one lamp, not the entire ship. Flicker. Pause. Flicker. Similar to a signal. Then there was quiet. Even though I didn't get much sleep, I rushed to the front desk as soon as the sun rose. There was the same girl who had checked me in. The moment she recognized me, her smile wavered. What's up with cabin 943? I made a demand. Her mouth opened. But before she could say anything, a man wearing a navy jacket, possibly a supervisor of some sort, came to her side. With ease, he interrupted. "Is there an issue, sir?" I asked the same question again. His smile was too well practiced and polished. "Every cabin is completely safe, sir." He led me away with a hand on my shoulder, and when I turned to look behind him, the receptionist was pale and had her hands clenched at her sides. "You might just be feeling the normal discomfort of acclimating to life at sea. That ought to have been sufficient to persuade me to change rooms. However, curiosity or perhaps stubbornness left me stuck at 943. Things ceased being subtle on the 4th night. The porthole shook strongly at precisely 3 in the morning. Sweat clung to the covers as I jumped up in bed. The window trembled as though there was an external force beating on it, but there were just black waves to be seen miles out from shore in the middle of the ocean. Then I noticed, them. Against the glass were pale faces, half-formed, warped by the porthole's curvature, silent mouth movements. Wet streaks are left on the glass by hands slapping it. The faces remained visible as I scurried back until I struck the wall across from me. They simply remained, leaning against the glass and observing, and I realized it wasn't only a signal when the lamp flickered once more. It was dialogue. They were being answered by something or someone inside the room, and I was no longer alone. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that my cottage had turned into a trap by the 5th day. They appeared to be pressing in from another universe, silently pleading to be allowed inside, and I kept seeing those pale faces against the porthole. I had convinced myself that switching rooms was the wisest course of action. Simply leave. We're at full capacity, no other cabins available, I was told bluntly when I returned to the front desk. The man in the navy jacket, who had previously interrupted me, stood close by, observing me with that courteous smile that never left his eyes. He said, "We can send housekeeping to check your cabin if that makes you more comfortable, sir." I didn't like the thought of strangers looking around my room when I wasn't there. Nevertheless, I nodded. "All right, do it." Everything appeared to be the same when I got back later that afternoon. The bathroom was cleaned and the bed was made. However, there was one particular aspect that made me tense. My lamp, the one that flickered constantly, was gone from the desk, swapped out by a shiny newer model. I initially believed that housekeeping might have replaced it. However, there was a little piece of masking tape with the 3 numbers, 943, scrawled in pen, stuck beneath the new lamp's base. Hardly visible. Why write my cabin number on a lamp? And why make it so clear? The knocking came again that night, this time on the walls rather than the door. Crawling through the room were hollow thuds that came from inside the plaster. Knock, pause, knock, knock, as if it were looking for a way in. I almost backed away as I put my ear against the wall. Breathing was present. Not imaginable, not faint, as if someone had put their lips directly against the plaster. Heavy, strained breaths were leaking through the barrier. I tossed in bed, counting down the hours till daybreak, and hardly slept at all. However, it was no longer just the cabin. I walked the decks the following morning in an attempt to decompress. The sea encircled us indefinitely, the water glistening in the sunlight. I felt as though I could be free of that oppressive fear for the first time in days, until I saw the same middle-aged woman who had previously issued the warning. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon as she stood close to the rail. When I carefully walked up to her, she remarked, "You stayed in the room. How do you know about it?" I inquired. When she turned, her face was lifeless, as though she had lost her vitality. Because I also did. It was 2 years ago. Same cabin, she said, her voice breaking into a whisper. Where you go on this ship now is irrelevant. Desperate for answers, I urged her. But she paused, her eyes flashing behind me. It's already chosen you. I turned to see a uniformed crewman standing too close, grinning the same practiced smile I was beginning to despise. Enjoying the view of the waters, he inquired courteously. The woman was gone when I turned around. She disappeared, I promise. With the open deck so broad, there was no place for her to run that fast. However, she was no longer present. I made the error of attempting to permanently depart the cabin that night. After packing my things, I sprinted down the hallway and made my way to the stairway. But beneath me, the ship appeared to twist. I kept coming back to the same hallway around every corner, doors with the same numbers, 939, 941, 943, repeatedly, until I understood that I wasn't simply lost. I couldn't get off the ship, and the number on the wall validated my dread when I eventually opened the door to what should have been a separate cabin. I owned it. I had returned to 943, and the door wasn't shut this time. It was waiting, fully open, silent and black. The cabin stood open like a mouth, taking me in. The suitcase handle shook in my hands as I froze in the corridor. All of my instincts told me to go, but the hallways had already shown themselves to be countless traps. There was no other option. The air changed as soon as I crossed the threshold. It was colder, so chilly that in the gloom I could see my breath fogging. My new light gave out a sickly yellow glare after flickering once and then buzzing to life. The slight glitter of the number pasted beneath the base almost begged me to remove it. I stooped and placed my suitcase on the bed. The tape was no longer only masking tape. It was parchment, brittle, dry, and darkly discolored. Instead of using a pen, the numerals 943 were scrawled in what appeared to be thick, dried ink, or blood. I ripped it free with trembling hands, and written into the metal itself, beneath the lamp's base, are the words, "Another one for the ship." My stomach churned. The words appeared to glimmer dimly in the darkness, even after I slammed the lamp off. The whispering followed. It began as a murmur coming from the walls, resembling the simultaneous speech of dozens of voices that overlapped and blended into a form that wasn't quite language. The surface of the plaster rippled when I touched it with my palms, similar to skin, as if something from within were pushing outside. Then, knock, make a knock, make a knock. The door automatically locked as it swung shut behind me. I yanked at the handle as I whirled around, my heart racing. Nothing. The murmurs increased in volume. Clothes were all over the floor when my luggage fell off the bed and exploded. However, there was nothing of mine mixed in with them, rather a pile of old, faded pictures, black and white with edges that curled, people clinking champagne glasses, posing near lifeboats, and grinning on deck, and deep, enraged gouges had been slashed out of their faces, all of them, face up. The last picture slipped out. I gasped. I was the one, with my suitcase in hand and a worried smile on my face. I was standing exactly as I had when I originally boarded, and both of my eyes were gouged into black, empty holes. When I saw movement in the porthole's reflection, I stumbled back, my throat shutting. Not the ocean. The stars, no. However, dozens of white faces were plastered against the glass, mute moans coming from their mouths. They smudged the window with their fingertips, pleading for admission. Then I spotted her, in the midst of them. The deck woman. Her lips formed unintelligible syllables, as her lifeless gaze remained locked on me. Then all of a sudden I did. Her mouth and the murmurs in the walls matched. to form a single coherent statement. It is now your turn. The porthole glass trembled, those pale hands struggled to get through, and cracks spiderwebbed outward. I hurled myself back against the door and banged on it while yelling for assistance. No one arrived, but the metal moaned. At that moment, the lamp turned itself back on, and the numbers below the base were different this time. 944 is no longer my cabin number. The following one. With a start, I understood what it meant. Instead of simply taking passengers, the ship cycled through each cabin, marking each one, and it was almost my turn. I wasn't only confined, they were going to replace me. The last sound I heard was the crewman's courteous, practiced voice coming from somewhere inside the room. "Welcome aboard, sir," as the porthole exploded inward and freezing seawater raced across the floor. "Enjoy your stay." The wave hit me hard, scorching my throat and eyes with salt water. I reached for the door with my claws, but the metal frame remained strong as the handle twisted on its own. The frigid tide was quickly filling the cabin, reaching my neck, chin, and instead of screaming, the faces in the porthole now grinned. Unnaturally wide smiles that seemed to welcome me into their quiet presence. When the woman who had talked to me first flattened her hand against the glass, her eyes turned white, and she said the last word, "Stay." The water engulfed me. My lungs were bursting as I thrashed, and then there was stillness. No water. There is no pressure. No discomfort. Dry as bone. I stood in the center of the hut. The bed was set up nicely. The suitcase had a zipper. The bulb on the nightstand was softly glowing. However, there was a problem. I staggered over to the wall mirror. It was no longer me in the reflection. As though I had drowned years ago. My face was pale, my eyes were sunken, and my lips were blue, despite the fact that I had not moved. My reflection tilted its head and smiled. There was a happy click as the cabin door opened behind me. A family entered after that. A mother, father, and little son giggling uneasily while lugging their bags. When he spotted me, the boy froze. His gaze expanded, pulling on his father's arm. He whimpered, "Daddy, why is there a man in our room?" However, my parents didn't see me. I felt them stroll right through me. Slowly, I faced the mirror once more. The words that scratched my bones were whispered by my leaned forward reflection. Another one for the ship. The door closed. The lock swung. The cycle then started over. The question still stands. How many cabins are already occupied by travelers who haven't checked out? Additionally, how can you be certain that the number taped to your lamp doesn't already belong to someone else when you make your next cruise reservation? Because the dead don't go away on this ship. Story 2. Have you ever noticed how the ocean absorbs ships instead of merely encircling them? That's what makes cruises unpleasant. You're stranded in a floating hotel with just black water below, cut off from the outside world. One such journey is the source of tonight's story. A terrifying tale that never left the woman who experienced it. She was a 33-year-old Oregonian elementary school teacher named Vanessa Harper. She wasn't the kind to experiment with the paranormal or seek thrills. The goal of this cruise was to celebrate surviving another demanding school year that involved juggling students, lesson planning, and standardized testing. The objective was to sleep, eat, and finally read a book cover to cover without interruption. She saved money, reserved a mid-sized stateroom with a balcony, and told her pals that was her intention. Vanessa had a feeling something wasn't quite right from the first night aboard. She characterized the air as heavy as soon as she entered her cabin, like entering a room where people had just been fighting and walked out, leaving their rage hanging in the air. Heavy, nor musty, nor stale. The view from her balcony was breathtaking, with unending waves disappearing into the orange horizon. However, she continued to have the unsettling impression that someone was already in the room with her when she turned back inside. Do you recognize the feeling when your arms start to prickle before your brain recognizes danger? That was with her all the time. She wrote it off as travel jitters the first night. She took a shower, unpacked, and tried to fall asleep. But it would be difficult to fall asleep. She woke up at precisely 3001 to sound of dripping. Not from the ceiling, not from the bathroom. It was directly next to her bed. She turned the lamp on. A tiny puddle had formed on the carpet near her bedside table. When she went to bed, she vowed it wasn't there. Her stomach turned as she realized, startled, that the puddle wasn't water and went to get towels. It had a metallic flavor and was thick and black, blood. With her heart racing, she scurried back, only to blink and see that the puddle was gone. The carpet had dried. I saw not a drop. That was the first night. When Vanessa woke up on the second night, the humid ocean air was streaming in through her balcony door, which had opened itself. Perhaps she had forgotten to lock it, so she got up to close it. But she froze when she peered out. When she noticed a damp handprint that was bigger than her own smeared on the glass on the inside, she started to actually feel watched. Once her personal haven, the cabin felt confining, and the thing that was telling her about it was getting bolder every minute. Vanessa made an effort to persuade herself that it was simply exhaustion, the result of the mind's trickery while under stress. For heaven's sake, she was a teacher, and her default settings were reason and logic. But even though she knew she had the deadbolt in place, the way her cabin door trembled as though someone were pulling on it from the hallway defied sense. The ship was a dream during the day, buffets bursting at the seams, music floating across sunlit decks, pools splattering with laughter. It was as though she were living in two distinct realities, one that was bright and innocuous, and the other that was drenched in anxiety and waiting in her cabin. Vanessa started talking to Eleanor, a Florida-based retired nurse at the pool bar on the third afternoon. Vanessa nonchalantly said that she hadn't been getting enough sleep in her room while sipping iced daiquiris. Eleanor's grin dimmed. "On which deck are you?" she inquired. "7," replied Vanessa. "Midship." Eleanor's face became so pale that Vanessa believed she might pass out in Her voice was low as she leaned close. "You must request a transfer." The words startled Vanessa. "Tonight." As she waited for Eleanor to clarify, she laughed uneasily. "They shouldn't be booking that one anymore," the elder woman muttered, shaking her head. Then excused herself and vanished into the crowd. Vanessa left the TV on that evening since the illumination from the screen was her only source of solace. She slept off, but was awakened by the TV cutting out with a hiss of static at 3 in the morning, that damn time. For a brief period, she caught a glimpse of a man's reflection on the blank screen. With his shoulders down and water flowing from his hair into the carpet, he stood right behind her bed. His lips were an unusual shade of blue and his face was bloated. He gazed through the glass as if he were imprisoned there, his eyes dead yet focused on her. Vanessa whirled around so quickly that she almost fell off the mattress. There was nobody in the room. Quiet. She shivered as she grabbed her phone to see what time it was. It was exactly the same as the first night. The door refused to move when she attempted to exit the room. She pushed her weight into it and turned the lock, but it remained locked, as though the cabin itself would not allow her to leave. The air grew heavier, her ears ringing. The distinct sound of water running on the carpet came from the corner, next to the balcony door. Slowly, she turned. The same dark, rippling pool was expanding again, moving toward her bare feet. However, it wasn't going away this time. She noticed them when she looked up from it. 2 dripping footprints, bare, human, and unable to be fresh. They escorted her to her bed from the balcony. Vanessa's breath was stuck in her throat like glass fragments. As she gripped her chest, the TV came back to life with a voice. Not hers. Not someone she knew, whispering a single word through the static. "Drown." Not wanting anything to break the oppressive quiet, she whispered out loud, "Please, someone help me." Vanessa didn't sleep the rest of the night. Her eyes were fixed on the footsteps that had seeped into the carpet as she sat curled against the cabin wall, every nerve burning. They were almost vanished before daybreak, as though they had never existed at all. Vanessa felt alone on the ship, bearing a secret too heavy for daylight, when the morning announcement, as upbeat as ever, arrived, promoting breakfast buffets and poolside activities. She found Eleanor again at brunch. When Vanessa sat across from her, looking pale and trembling, the elderly nurse didn't seem startled. "You did see him, did you not?" Eleanor murmured. Vanessa's dish clattered as her fork struck it. Who? Eleanor's voice was flat and confident as she said, "The man from the water. He appears on the third night or so. Always the same." With her hands shaking so much that she had to hold her coffee cup with both, Vanessa demanded an explanation. With a sigh, Eleanor looked around the packed dining room. Eleanor whispered, "A crewman died in that cabin years ago. Perhaps he fell, but he jumped. Nobody is aware. However, 2 days later, his body was discovered in the water, blue and swollen, exactly as you've observed. Passengers have been complaining about things like cold water on the carpet, voices on the TV, and doors that lock by themselves ever since. They make an effort to keep the room reserved. Ships are reluctant to acknowledge that their staterooms are cursed." Vanessa swallowed hard. Her logical mind held on to stress, hallucinations, excuses, and cruise ship legend. But denial was impossible because of Eleanor's unwavering, steady gaze. "Why me?" Nearly whispering, Vanessa asked. Eleanor paused. "Because he doesn't want to be forgotten," he said softly. "Every time he travels, he becomes attached. Someone who takes notice." "You've already noticed?" Vanessa asked for a cabin change that evening. The receptionist smiled politely but firmly at her. "I apologize, ma'am. We have a packed schedule." They were, of course. So, with fear like a vice squeezing on her ribs, Vanessa went back to cabin 714. She refused to lie down and was pacing the room by midnight. She jumped at every sound, even the subtle creak of metal, the groan of the walls, and the hum of the air conditioner. The balcony door shivered around 3:05 a.m. The glass was tightly closed, yet the curtains blew inward. Then tap, tap, the sound of knuckles tapping the interior of the closet door. Vanessa stopped. She constricted her throat. She was immobile. The tapping became sharper and louder, until the thin door began to vibrate against its hinges. Her legs refused to respond, despite her survival instinct screaming for her to run. Once, twice, and then slowly, the door handle rattled. The closet opened with a creak. Vanessa saw only shadows for a moment. Then someone leaned out and poured seawater onto the carpet, staring at her with dead, glassy eyes. The crewman. He parted his lips. The lights in the cabin went out as he rasped, "It's your turn." Salt water poured from between his lips. The cabin was completely engulfed by the blackout. Out of sheer dread, Vanessa's cry was choked off in her throat, as if the figure were approaching her in the dark. She could hear water trickling steadily, like a clock, closer and closer. Her trembling fingers slipped across the glass as she scrambled for her phone on the nightstand. For a brief moment, the room was illuminated by the dim illumination emitted by the screen. Empty, wide open, the closet door swayed softly, like though it were breathing. Not a man. Don't drip. It smelled of rot and salt, like low tide that had been exposed to the sun for too long. She gasped for breath. She was still sensing him. He was present, and she knew it. A murmur brushed her ear. "Don't look behind you." Vanessa whirled, the phone light cutting through the darkness, but nothing was visible. The door was sealed shut, leaving only the naked wall and the balcony curtains fluttering. That was the tipping point. With her phone held like a lifeline, she ran down the corridor barefoot as she fled the cabin. As she ran, 2 people dressed for the evening moved aside, scowling at her, but remaining silent. No one ever spoke. She discovered that the ship's theater was almost deserted at this late hour, with only a few crew members fixing the props, trying to regulate her breathing. She fell into a seat. Beside her, Eleanor emerged. Vanessa didn't even wonder how she had discovered her so fast. "You can't run forever," Eleanor remarked quietly. Vanessa took hold of her arm. The elderly woman examined her face and said, "Tell me how to stop him. He is not stopped by you. You put up with him until the ship comes to rest. He chooses someone else once you leave. However, you must never give him a blatant acknowledgement. He can hold on to that. Vanessa wanted to yell at her. Never give him a hand. She had already screamed, pleaded, and looked him in the eyes. It was too late. She slept with the lights on that night, and used furniture to block the closet door. She still dreamed of drowning, with her hands clawing at the water's surface, and her lungs burning as an unseen weight pulled her beneath. Her bedding were wet with chilly waves when she woke up. Vanessa didn't go near her cabin at all on the last night of the vacation. With her eyes focused on the horizon, she remained on deck, gripping coffee after coffee. Around 2 in the morning, the sea was engulfed by a fog. The passengers returned to their lodgings. She was almost abandoned. Then she heard it once more. That dragging, damp footstep. In the fog, he was there. Even though she couldn't see him, she could feel the cold leave her body. Too deliberate and too slow to be human. The footsteps surrounded her. The voice, bubbling with seawater, emerged from the mist and said, "Vanessa," her name. The fog suddenly split as the ship's horn blared through the night, and he knew her name. Vanessa staggered back. The footsteps disappeared. The air got warmer. By dawn, land was visible. Vanessa was one of the first people to disembark. As soon as the ship stopped, holding tight to her suitcase and looking back every few seconds, with the city traffic strewn all around her, she didn't stop until she was in a taxi. She thought she would breathe again for the first time in days. However, she froze as she unpacked at home. A pair of wet crewman's gloves was found at the bottom of her bag, sandwiched between her garments. She had noticed the identical gloves soaking on the floor of the closet. Below them, water gathered. Vanessa believed she had forgotten everything when she saw the words, "You can't leave the ocean," scribbled in salt residue on the inside of the lid. As if by a moist finger, gloves and all, the suitcase ended up in the trash. Even after she scrubbed her floors until her knees hurt, her apartment still had a slight briny odor. With her windows open to the city air at 2 in the morning, her upstairs neighbors likely thought she was crazy. Life appeared to be stable for a few days. She went back to work in the office, grinned at colleagues who remarked on her post-vacation glow, and made herself laugh as if she had truly had a typical vacation. She even persuaded herself that it had all been a trick of fatigue, possibly even sleep paralysis. The water, however, never forgets. During a shower, the first indication appeared. When the water pressure changed, she closed her eyes and rinsed the shampoo out of her hair. The steady stream became thick and sluggish. When she opened her eyes, brownish water with seaweed particles in it dripped from the shower head. A torrent of bubbles coughed out from the drain, her heart pounding. She stumbled back. She briefly believed she saw fingers from the inside press on the shower door's glass. The drowning dream returned that night. As you went to sleep, she wasn't struggling in open water this time though. The sound of waves crashing against tiles filled her lungs. As she was confined to her own bathtub, she awoke with a cough dripping salt water into the sheets from her mouth. Her cell rang. A message, unlisted number. She erased it, saying, "You looked right at me." Blocked the number. However, they continued to arrive, each message smearing the screen like seawater stains, as though the phone itself was damp. She called Eleanor one night in desperation. She had quickly scrawled the old woman's number onto the back of a drink receipt, somehow saving it. On the second ring, Eleanor's voice was flat as she responded, "Never acknowledge him. I told you." "I didn't know," Vanessa stumbled. "He now recognizes your name. He won't let go." After saying, "You belong to the water," the line ended. Vanessa's co-workers discovered her desk chair empty, laptop open, and coffee still steaming next to it. The following morning, she was seen entering the building lobby on security cameras, but she never left. Weeks later, some claim she leaped from a ferry while her name was echoed over the waves. Others think she's still out there, peering out of a cabin window that shouldn't be there, on some midnight cruise that never records a ticket. And pay great attention if you ever find yourself standing by yourself in the fog on a ship. Don't turn around if you hear damp footsteps behind you, because he will also recognize your name once you look. Story 3. The cruise was not booked by me. The first thing I want you to comprehend is that my name is Rachel. I'm an Ohio school teacher, and I never intended to set foot on a luxury cruise. Instead of a floating hotel with casinos and water slides, my ideal holiday spot would be a hut in the woods with spotty Wi-Fi. However, the first-class ticket with my name printed in flawless block letters and all expenses covered arrived in the mail. I initially believed it to be a fraud, some too-good-to-be-true contest, but there was no sender, no explanation, just an embossed envelope with the ship's emblem, the ocean's embrace. However, the cruise line confirmed that my name was on the manifest when I called them. Thorough 9. Paid in full. The boarding pass was even sent by email. I was warned by friends not to go. My sister pleaded with me to discard the ticket, but I was bothered by something about it. For a stranger who would pay hundreds of dollars. My home address was unknown. I promised myself that if things became strange, I would simply board, look around, and depart at the next port. However, I felt selected as soon as I walked up the gangway. The other travelers were giddy with anticipation, using their beverages to take selfies, except for one man, an older steward with eyes like clouded glass and pale cheekbones. The crew hardly gave me a glance. His lips trembled around phrases he didn't pronounce out loud when he scanned my ticket. He stared at me as though he was learning my name by heart. The ship shone inside. Polished wood handrails, chandeliers that swung softly with movement, and carpeting that had a subtle mildew and salt odor that was impossible to cover up with washing. I felt lightheaded as the passageways repeated themselves in seemingly unending cycles. My cabin was ready, with the door unlocked. Through 9. Roomy. Too roomy. The bed was made as though I was anticipated. On the desk was a dish of fruit, but the grapes had dried out and the bananas had black spots. A trail of tiny ants spread as I took one up. At that moment, I nearly left. However, there was a note on the dresser that was perfectly square when folded. "Welcome aboard, Rachel. We've been waiting for you." It was written in neat handwriting. The problem is that when I turned the paper over, the back was wet, as though it had been pushed against seawater before drying. I went cold. The lights began to flicker at that point, just long enough to catch a glimpse of the mirror on the other side of the room. My reflection wasn't motionless. Even though I wasn't smiling, it was leaning forward and getting closer. Make sure you're subscribed to Midnight Outcry if you're still listening. There are stories you wish were true, and then there are those that sound phony. The cruise had not yet departed the harbor. I was well aware that I was in trouble. I was sitting rigidly on the side of the bed, holding that note as if it might explain itself if I squeezed it hard enough, when the horn finally blew, rattling the glassware in my cabin. With streamers falling into the water and throngs waving, the ship withdrew from the harbor. The quiet in my chamber juxtaposed with the joy outside. I attempted to persuade myself that it was some complex marketing ploy, perhaps a viral campaign gimmick. However, there was no one in the corridor when I opened the cabin door. Not even a whisper of conversation. No rolling baggage over the carpet. No laughter. The only sound coming through the walls was the gentle hum of the ship's engines. I saw the cabin doors opposite mine at that moment. They all had shiny brass numbers. 319, but right across from 309, nothing. There was a door without a number or a peephole. I approached it and put my ear to it. Quiet, then scratching faintly. It's more like wood being cut from the inside out than nails. My gut churned. When I turned around, I almost ran into a crewman pushing a cart full of linens. He didn't recoil. His eyes were staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. "Pardon me, do you know what's behind that door?" I stumbled. He didn't pause or even look at me, simply rolled by as though I hadn't been there. After a single creak of the wheels, there was silence. The oddity intensified over dinner, with golden chandeliers above and violins playing softly next to the buffet. The dining hall was a beautiful space. I took a seat at a big table with wine glasses full and plates, all arranged. Couples, families, and a man in a navy suit who nodded courteously were among the other passengers who gradually arrived, all around me. There was conversation, but no one ever responded when I spoke. I inquired about the origins of the woman next to me. She grinned hazily, as if she hadn't heard, and chewed her steak. It wasn't until the violinist changed their song that I realized I might be worried. My skin crawled as the tune slowed and veered into minor chord. Nobody else responded. Children laughed as forks clinked, yet the sour, anxious melody continued to bend. I looked back toward the doors halfway through the dinner. Once more, the older steward who had scanned my ticket was there. In the corner, standing still, his head was cocked slightly in my direction, his hands clasped behind his back. He was gone as I blinked. I wandered the upper deck later that night, restless, with the moon smearing silver across the waves. The water appeared infinite and black. I tried to calm myself by leaning on the railing. At that moment, I sensed the ship trembling almost imperceptibly, like if something massive had brushed against the hull below. My bones rolled with a tremor. It wasn't only me who noticed. A few steps distant, a man with a pale face in the moonlight, wearing a sweatshirt, jerked his head toward the ocean. We looked at each other. He froze after opening his mouth to speak. Footsteps echoed behind me. I pivoted. There was no one on the deck. The man in the hoodie was gone when I turned to face him again, refusing to leave, avoiding slipping in, simply gone. I pushed a chair under the handle and locked the door after returning to my cabin. I was still uncomfortable with my image in the mirror, as if it were a little fraction of a second behind me, and there was a fresh note beside the withered fruit on the dresser. I hadn't written it. Cabin 309 was never meant to be occupied. Stay inside after midnight. No one had entered that I could hear. Nevertheless, there it was, the writing still shining as if it had been penned just moments before. It was 11:58 on the wall clock. The cabin clock's second hand, which read 11:59, jerked forward. With every tick, the walls felt as though they were getting closer, trying to determine whether to follow the warning or do the exact opposite. I sat motionless on the bed, my eyes darting between the message and the door. The lights then began to flicker, once, twice, and darkness fell over the whole cottage. From someplace far below the waterline, the ship's engine hum stuttered and dipped low like a moan. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was still black even after pressing the power button. Just unresponsive, not dead. The silence was broken by a sound, not the hushed sounds of late-night wanderers, not footsteps. There was a deep, prolonged scraping sound, as if something were pulling metal across the carpet in the hallway. It passed each cabin door slowly and cautiously, approaching. Once, the chair that was anchored beneath my handle trembled, but then again, there was no knock from whatever was outside. The wood creaked as it pressed firmly. I stumbled over my luggage and backed up, gasping for air. The door remained intact. The scraping continued and then faded away. However, another sound took its place before the relief could subside. Whispers, many voices, not just one, inhuman rhythms of rising and falling, layered and weaving over one another. They were no longer in the corridor. They were within the walls, behind my headboard, beneath the ground, all around me. Despite my efforts to shield my ears, the whispers became more intense and pierced the bone. Words came out, not in English, not in any of the languages I knew. However, I somehow grasped the message. Join us. Below. Always below. I was startled to my feet by a sharp crack. The mirror. A crack ran like a lightning bolt into the middle. Even though my lips were shut, my reflections moved as it gazed back at me. Quiet phrases that matched the murmurs in the walls exactly. Once again, the clock struck 12. Midnight. All of the room's lights suddenly blazed back on, blindingly bright. The mirror darkened, revealing just shadow. The unexpected hush made my ears ring. Then the knock was heard. 3 savage raps. Not at my door. At the one without a number, the blank one across the hall. With trembling hands, I slipped over to the peephole. The hallway was deserted. But the knocking went on. More volume. More pressing. A voice at last. A female's. Calm, smooth, but with a hint of cold. The numberless door's handle rattled. "You should not have come here. But since you have, you will have to make a decision." With a pounding heart, I staggered back. A draft that shouldn't have been in a sealed cabin caused the note on my dresser to fly to the floor. The writing had altered by the time I picked it up. I stared at the note until the letters became blurry, and it said, "Open it, or it opens you." Even though I hadn't moved an inch, my chest heaved as if I had been running. My brain rang with the sound of the numberless door handle twisting, like whatever was inside knew I would ultimately give in. It was patient and steady. However, I didn't. I grabbed the chair beneath my own door, swung it open, and staggered into the hallway. Long lengths of shadow broke across the patterned carpet as the hallway lights flickered. The faint knock 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 from across the corridor was still audible, but I dared not turn round. I quickly made my way to the atrium, the center of the ship where all of the passengers congregated during the day. It should have been quiet and empty at this hour. Rather, I heard voices, laughter, the sound of glasses clinking. I felt a wave of relief till I entered. Warm golden light filled the large lounge, and chandeliers sparkled as if nothing were amiss. The passengers were dressed in the same sophisticated evening costume that I had observed them wearing during dinner hours, and they were mingling around the piano while sipping champagne. But something wasn't quite right. Their motions were too coordinated and fluid. Their chuckles were empty, and their eyes, all of them, suddenly turned to face me. A woman in a red gown emerged from the crowd, her face rigid like a mask that was too tight, yet her smile broad. She lifted her glass. "Did you not hear the knock?" I froze. All at once, the others started whispering, not in conversation but as a chorus. I heard the same strange rhythm in my walls. I took a step back and said, "Below, below, below." Like a flood, their bodies moved in unison as they drew nearer without losing rhythm. Every step was perfectly timed. I whirled and bolted. The arrangement of the ship now twisted oddly, with stairs sending me in circles and hallways doubling back where they shouldn't. I could still hear the echo of coordinated steps behind me at every bend. At last, I staggered into a side hallway where the sound of the motors intensified. There was a man, an elderly traveler, leaning back against the wall on the floor. His eyes were open but unfocused. His lips were cracked and his skin was pallid. I knelt next to him. "Hey, how are you?" He took hold of my wrist with unexpected force. His voice was as dry as sandpaper as he rasped, "Don't open it. Never open it. They enter that way." My blood froze. "Who?" However, his eyes darted to the hallway behind me before he could respond. His face contorted in sheer fear. After saying, "They've found you," his body slackened and fell apart like a puppet whose strings were severed. I heard it again from the darkness at the end of the hallway. That metallic scratch that drags. It wasn't alone this time, though. Over it were dozens of whispers, as if the entire ship had joined in. Once more, the lights flickered out. Complete darkness. Then a door creaked open up ahead, and a youthly hand curled around the frame, calling me forward from the emptiness beyond. With incredibly long fingers and nails that clicked like bug legs on the wood, the pale hand held onto the frame. My feet refused to move even though my body was screaming for me to run. The air itself seemed to have swelled around me, and I felt pinned. No longer muffled by walls, the whispers grew louder. These voices, which weren't quite human, surged into a head from all directions. I pushed myself to stagger back, but the hallway had altered once more. Below, the patterned carpet ran endlessly beneath my feet, while the walls stretched and twisted like soft clay. The ship had changed from being made of steel and metal to being living, changing, and observing. That hand was still there, coiled around the gaping entryway. The distance grew. A face appeared. At first it was featureless and colorless, like skin that had been squeezed too tightly over bone. Then, slowly, details emerged from underneath, with mouths emerging where they shouldn't, eyes protruding against the surface, and whispers that were perfectly insane. Like an imitation, every face was incorrect. I saw the faces of the passengers in the lounge. I spun around and took off running. Every step I took caused the passage to pulse, breathing all around me. I sprawled as the floor swung violently to one side. My hands brushed the carpet, which suddenly felt sticky and wet. I noticed that it was skin instead of fabric as I looked down. I let out a yell. I struggled ahead, in the direction of a dim light at the end of the corridor. When I got there, it was only a porthole, but the light swayed like a lantern. Outside, beneath the night sky, the ocean roiled wildly, and something I will never be able to remove was there. Rising from the black water, a form bigger than the actual ship. Innumerable arms, each tipped with the same pallid hands, reached upward from a monstrous mass, whispering the same word repeatedly. Faces writhed across its torso. The ship moaned and tilted as if to bow to it, saying, "Below." As they approached the porthole, passengers streamed from adjacent passageways, their coordinated steps resonating. Their smiles were overly broad, and their eyes were vacant. They didn't yell. They embraced it. A second hand closed over my shoulder as I retreated. I turned, but all I saw was a blank mask of skin. No face. Being pulled in the direction of the door without a number is the last thing I recall. This time, it spread further, exposing nothing but an impossibly deep darkness that went deeper than the ocean. I was filled from the inside out by the voices. I vanished as my body got weightless. My name appeared on the manifest when the ship docked a week later. However, I was not one of the travelers that disembarked, except for a solitary piece of paper pinned to the door. My cabin was deserted. Below, it was inscribed repeatedly, etched so deeply that it had ripped through the wood itself. Story 4. From what I've read in passenger testimonies, it never seems to begin explosively when something goes wrong at sea. It begins quietly, so quietly that you may think you made it up. This one starts just like that. The Radiant Star was a high-end cruise liner that was well known for its endless buffets and nocturnal entertainment events. That's what the pamphlet said. Anyway, however, Lucas, a 34-year-old Chicago travel blogger, says that neither the cuisine nor the music are what he remembers most. It's the quiet. Lucas had been out on one of the observation balconies on his second night aboard, setting up his camera for a time-lapse while the rest of the guests crowded the main deck for a gala dinner. The sky was starry, and the sea was still. Ideal circumstances. Until it wasn't. His ears exploded. His breath froze in his throat, and then he realized that the entire ship had gone utterly silent as the air changed, which Lucas later compared to walking into a sealed room. Not even the faint buzz of engines. No laughing, no footfall. The sound of waves hitting the hull was absent. The ship appeared to have been plunged into a vacuum. He heard it at that point. There was a vibration instead of sounds, like if something enormous were rubbing against the hull far below. He looked down into the dark sea while leaning over the railing. There was something huge, pallid, coiling just beneath the surface, and for a moment he believed he saw movement. "Please tell me that's just my imagination," he said to himself. But the balcony door behind him opened. Nobody went outside. In the silence, the door creaked as it hung wide. It appeared as though the lights had been dimmed solely in the hallway beyond, which was darker than it should have been. Lucas yelled, anticipating a crew member or another traveler. No answer, just that oppressive stillness drawing nearer. Then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps emerged from deep within the hull. Lucas froze in place, his camera still silently ticking away as it recorded the stars above. But his gaze had shifted away from the sky. His attention was fixed on that corridor, where the heavy, uneven footsteps dragged one after the other. It was more than just the sound that made his skin crawl. The reason for this was that their footfall weren't resonating as they should on a steel deck. They made a muted sound, like bare feet stepping on wet ground. "Hello?" he said into the darkness. "Is there anyone present?" No response, just as the figure should have been highlighted by the hall light. The footsteps came to a sudden halt at the doorway. However, there was nothing but darkness. A sort of darkness that was darker than the shadows cast by the rest of the ship. Then the odor appeared. The open entryway was filled with a saline, moist stench that smelled like sun-baked rotting seaweed. With one hand covering his lips, Lucas gulped. His first impulse was to close the door and dash back to the dining room, as if this had never occurred. However, his camera continued to roll, aiming directly at the odd, dim hallway. "If you run now, you'll never know what you just caught," the storyteller and blogger inside him whispered. So he took the camera off the tripod and walked gently forward. The temperature of the air plunged as soon as his foot touched the threshold, causing his skin to prickle with a sharp, piercing chill. The red recording light on the camera was dimly reflected off the walls as he raised it. Through the glass, he was able to see something that was invisible to his naked eye. A damp, shiny trail that led deeper inside and was smeared down the carpet. Lucas swiftly lowered the camera. The trail was gone without it. His throat constricted. "All right. Nope, nope, nope." He turned, preparing to go back outside to the balcony himself. But in his face, the door that had been wide open suddenly slammed shut. The hit made the ship tremble. In his sweaty hands, his camera slid and nearly fell to the ground. And a voice whispered, low, drawn out, wet sounding from the far end of the hall, where the shadows clung abnormally thick. Lucas. This time he almost actually dropped the camera. His name shouldn't be known by anyone on this ship. The lights began to flicker at that point. He watched the hallway light up for a half-heart. Standing at the far end was an unnaturally tall figure with arms dangling to its knees, a head bowed so far that it nearly touched its chest, and skin that was excessively tight and gleaming as if it had just crawled out of the ocean. Then there was darkness once more. The footsteps came again, nearer. Lucas struggled for the handle of the door while pressing his back against it, but it would not move. It wasn't locked, but he tried twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't open. He nearly lost the ability to hear the thing approaching him. Those dragging, sticky steps, accompanied by the slightest drip, drip, drip on the floor, because his heartbeat was thundering so loudly in his ears. His hands trembled violently as he held his camera. The creature was closer now, its twisted frame jerking strangely as it walked, and for a brief period, the lens flickered, attempting to adapt to the faint light. Lucas could tell it was smiling when its neck snapped slightly to one side, but the smile was too wide and nearly split its cheeks. In a barely audible voice, he said, "Please, no." The lights above him buzzed, fighting for life. He saw the figure, first from a few yards away, in a terrifying strobe-like perspective, with each flicker. Halfway down the hallway, the next blink, then it blinked again. Near enough for Lucas to see the seawater pattering on the floor and its soaking hair falling in clumps. He made himself lift the camera once more. More shadows started to move behind the figure, revealing something his eyes were unable to see. Dozens of them. They were twisted, their feet dragging together, their heads bent at the same impossible angle. Lucas's breathing became labored. When he looked away from the camera, the hallway was deserted. Nothing. Not a number. Not a shadow. Nothing but quiet. His chest flooded with relief as he laughed shakily. He whispered, "Jesus Christ, I'm going crazy." Then there was a slight mechanical buzz from his camera. He looked at the screen below. The recording continued. The video showed the apparition standing just inches away, with a broad smile on its face and a skeletal hand reaching for his throat. The lights go off. The only sounds remaining were the agonizing pull of something approaching in the darkness and the moist rasp of breathing. The darkness was oppressive. Holding his breath, Lucas froze, hoping that his own heartbeat wouldn't be too loud to reveal who he was. Desperate for a light switch, a panel, anything, his fingers stroked the wall, but all he felt was icy, wet steel. The breathing then changed. It was out of his line of sight. It was up there, with all his muscles wailing against it. He slowly raised his head. Something liquid trickled over his cheek in the darkness. His lips ached from the salt, seawater. The camera clattered against his chest as he staggered backward. The little red recording light, a tiny rebellious gleam against the abyss, blinked. It dawned on him then that the ship was no longer silent. Faint, coordinated thuds, like hundreds of bare feet slamming on metal, came from all directions. With shaking hands, Lucas lifted the camera in the hopes that the lens would see what his eyes were unable to. His throat locked as the screen came to life. The corridor was packed. Waterlogged figures stood cheek to shoulder in dozens, perhaps hundreds. Their eyes were clouded, their mouths were open in silent cries, and their skin was strained and colorless. He quickly removed the camera. Darkness. He gestured it back. Closer now. The dead were still there. Their arms twitched strangely as one of them stumbled forward. The others came in perfect time, their actions precise but jerky as they converged on him. The air was filled with the sound of water dripping, akin to rain striking hollow pipes. Lucas snapped, "Please, stop," and pressed his back against the unyielding door. He pulled on the handle once more, but it remained in place. The steel vibrated behind him as if it were being held shut from the opposite side by someone or something. Static spilled across the picture as the camera screen crackled. For a moment, he saw not just the passage, but the ocean itself, with faces hovering just below the surface and black waves surging ahead. The dead were almost upon him when the static subsided. Lucas screamed and slammed his fist on the door. The roar of the water drowned out his speech as it reverberated down the corridor. A skeletal fingers, slimy and icy, brushed against his arm. Then another clutched his shoulder with frightful vigor. The door exploded. He fell backward into a chamber that wasn't supposed to be there. Lanterns swayed softly, seemed tossed by the waves, and the walls were dripping with dampness. A rusty table was in the middle of the space, and on it was an open logbook with damp pages curling. Panting, he clambered to his feet. One line, "Another has been picked," was still visible despite the bleed from the logbook's ink. "The ship feeds tonight." The door behind him banged. The sound of water rising slow at first, then rushing filled the room. Shaking, Lucas gripped the camera and prayed into it, saying, "If anyone finds this, don't board this ship. You're not going on a cruise with it. It's feeding." The screen darkened. For a brief period, the camera flickered back to life, its faint light bouncing off the rising water. Lucas was already waist deep, his cuts hurting from the salt and his bones being bitten by the cold. The notebook was smudged beyond recognition, save for a statement that kept coming up that made his stomach drop. "They never leave." He tried it again, flipping frenzied pages in the hopes of finding instructions, a way out, anything. "They only join." A deep moan, not mechanical but organic, sounded like the belly of something living, resonating through the steel wall. With the exception of the red recording light on his chest, Lucas was once more in the dark when the lanterns flickered and went out. His chest was filled with water. He gasped in ragged breaths. As if confessing, he pressed the camera close and whispered, "It's not a ship, it's a mouth." The water rushed in and pulled him down. He struggled to come to the surface, but invisible hands grabbed his ankles and pulled him farther. He caught a glimpse of the drowning passengers through the haze of bubbles, their eyes fixed on him as they pulled him down. Their faces stretched, their jaws agape. He felt the darkness pressing on his flesh as the current dragged him deeper and farther than the room should have permitted. Like dying fish, the logbook pages drifted around him, shimmering dimly before vanishing completely. Then there was stillness. No sound, no fight, no water. After blinking, Lucas found himself back in a corridor. Dry, quiet, empty. The ship had the same patterned carpet, polished brass rails, and soft music coming from the ballroom as it had on his first night there. The camera was still hooked to his chest, and his clothing were completely dry. He felt a rush of relief. But then he became aware of something strange. Travelers walked down the corridor, conversing, smiling, and enjoying cocktails. However, he noticed that their eyes were all blurry, each and every one. A steward tipped his cap as he passed him. Lucas started to say something, but the steward leaned in first and said, "Welcome aboard," with a smile too big for his face. "You're now one of us." Lucas stumbled back and the camera swung violently. He saw himself reflected in a neighboring pane of glass. His eyes clouded like the others, his lips tinted blue, his complexion pallid. Startled, he dropped the camera. With a sharp snap, it fell to its side on the floor as he leaned down shaking and muttered his final words to whoever might be watching. "I didn't survive the storm." The lens gazed up at him, as if from somewhere far below. The faint sound of water trickling echoed as the recording faded to dark. I became part of it. Story 5. I heard an unfamiliar sound when I woke up in my cabin. It wasn't the steady thrum of waves hitting steel or the soft hum of the engines. It was more gentle, much like breathing. It was dim enough to make me question whether I was dreaming, but not close. Trevor Hayes is my name. This cruise was meant to be my first genuine vacation after burning out at a job that required me to stare at computers for 14 hours a day. I'm 35 and work in IT security. With the best of intentions, my sister gave me the ticket, stating that I needed ocean air instead of Wi-Fi signals. If I'm being really honest, I was already regretting it. I had a bad feeling about the ship as soon as I stepped on board. Couples clinking drinks at the deck bar, sunburned children shouting at the pool, and endless buffets seemed like the usual for the first 2 days. But there was a strange undertone running through everything. More whispers than words were exchanged among passengers. The crew's excessive smile seemed practiced, and I would wake up to that sound. The breathing, every night. But it was different tonight. More volume. Nearer, as if someone were standing right outside the door of my cabin. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed. Above my bunk, the light flashed briefly before becoming steady. It might have been a neighbor suffering from sleep apnea, but I persuaded myself it was just thin walls. I even let out a tiny laugh to decompress. I looked into the hallway though, and it was deserted, silent, as if the ship were holding its breath. The following morning at breakfast, I made an effort to strike up a conversation with an Ohio couple on their 10th cruise, kind folks in their mid-50s. The woman paused mid-bite when I mentioned the weird noises at night in passing. Her spouse rushed to her side, clasped her wrist, and stifled a chuckle. My friend, old ship's creak, that's all. However, her big, beseeching eyes never left mine. I made the decision to remain up that night. With my camera in hand and ready to capture, I sat on the side of my bed. The hours passed slowly. Midnight arrived and left. I heard it again right when I thought I had wasted my time. Inhaling. Deliberate, steady, right outside my door. With the camera rolling, I edged closer. I grabbed for the handle with a trembling palm, half expecting it to be a drunk passenger playing about. In a single action, I yanked the door open, and the corridor was deserted. With the exception of the carpet, it was wet. It was as though someone had been there for a very long period. I knelt down and ran my fingertips over the carpet. Not only was it wet, but it was freezing cold, like glacial water. I felt sick to my stomach. Spills had not occurred. There were no drinking passengers passing. That breathing alone, even though I knew a cheap cruise ship lock wouldn't accomplish much, I backed into my cabin and silently closed the door, securing it. The red light on my camera continued to blink in the darkness as it continued to record. If anyone finds this, I swear. There was someone breathing outside my room. I muttered into it, as if making a confession. However, they were absent. Just water. I headed straight to guest services the following morning. I attempted to sound cool and collected, informed them about the moist carpet and the odd noises. The young man behind the counter, a member of the staff with the same fake smile I had seen earlier, didn't even blink. "We'll send housekeeping to dry it up. No worries." He simply nodded and typed something into his computer. Not surprisingly, the breathing returned that evening, this time louder, inside the door, not outside. The sound echoed through my cabin, and I froze, my body seizing up. I felt as though someone was standing just behind me, taking deep, ragged breaths. The air became humid and heavy. I was unable to force myself to look back. I only whispered, "Please tell me you hear this too," while staring into the camera lens. The cabin was deserted when I eventually made myself turn over my shoulder. However, the mirror on the other wall was foggy, as though someone had blown out directly into it. I ought to have asked for a different room. I ought to have contacted the captain directly. However, I had a feeling it wouldn't make a difference. I had a feeling they already knew. The Ohio couple failed to appear at breakfast 2 days later. Unused plates were still boiling on their customary table, which was empty. A crew member informed me that they had disembarked early at a port when I inquired about them, but I knew it was not feasible. Since we departed Miami, the ship had not docked anywhere. I heard the breathing once more that night, but it wasn't a single voice. There were a lot, layered, overlapping, and originating from the walls, ceiling, and corridor, as if 100 invisible lips were choking. After then, there was just one knock on my door. Slow, heavy, final. I didn't respond. I sat there trembling, hoping the lock would hold while the camera recorded every second. However, there was water glistening on the carpet underneath the door. The water spread rather than merely glistening, deliberately, slowly, seeping behind the door as if something were pressing against it from the opposite side. The carpet soaked through my socks and chilled my bare feet, making me shudder. The next smell was salt water, but it was putrid and old, as if it had been stuck in the ocean's belly for decades. I videotaped the door after yanking my camera closer. The video appeared distorted because my fingers trembled so much. "It's happening once more," I said. "It's not a leak. This is—" I paused. What adjective would best describe it? There was another knock, more volume. Then there was quiet. The water ceased to spread. The breathing slowed. The red light from my camera kept me calm as I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the door for the remainder of the night. Maybe I had dreamt it. I thought the following morning, till I entered the hallway. Outside my cabin, the carpet was completely dry, no water in sight, no rotten odor, nothing. I looked around the dining room at breakfast. The Ohio pair remained unaccounted for. Nothing went unused on cruises, therefore it seemed absurd that their seats hadn't been moved. Every inch was occupied by passengers. However, those two seats remained unmoved like ghost placeholders. Pushing a little harder than before, I started a conversation with a waitress. She lowered her voice and leaned closer. "Sir, try not to ask too many questions. It's best to leave some items underneath." That word persisted. Later, in an attempt to decompress, I sneaked into the ship's library, with polished wood tables and rows of leather seats shining beneath warm lighting. It was deserted. However, something fell out when I sat down with a random book. Tucked within like a secret message was a folded piece of paper. "They come back wet, always wet. Don't open the door when they knock. They'll try to make you breathe with them," was scrawled in a desperate scrawl on a ripped page of lined notebook paper. The handwriting seemed to have been halted in the middle of the phrase. With my heart pounding, I stuffed the note into my pocket and walked out of the library. I heard voices outside my hut that night when I was trying to go asleep. Not the typical sounds of a late-night party. They sounded low and muted, like underwater whispers. I squeezed my ear against the wall. He didn't listen. I stammered back, gripping my mouth. She opened the door. "And now they'll take another." In my ears, my heartbeat screamed. Then there was the distinct sound of water sloshing by my door. Something or someone had returned, as though waves were beating on the door from the opposite side. The sound of water hitting it became more intense. My hand was hovering over the handle, but the library's message flashed across my mind, telling me not to open the door when they knocked. I pushed myself back and spoke into my camera. "This is why I might disappear. It's true. It's all real." Then there was a knock. Slow, heavy. Every thud rattled the mirror on the other wall and shook the doorframe, as if bubbling through surf. The murmurs became a chorus. Jumbled. There was stillness after the words "breathe with us. Come below and open." I made the decision the following morning that I couldn't continue to be trapped in my cabin by my fear. I followed the crew-only signs, because I had to see what was being. I waited until I saw a preoccupied cleaner and snuck through the service door. Even though normally guests avoided those areas, this place had a distinct air, damper and colder, as if the ship itself breathed salt water. I entered a strange hallway after descending the slender metal stairway. No shiny brass, no shiny carpets. There are only rust patches, exposed pipes, and a slight hum that reverberates through the floor. Then I noticed it, seawater dripping from the seal of a sealed hatch with a dripping edge. I squatted down and pointed my flashlight at the words "Deck 0" written in faded paint above it. The water was dripping from the hatch's seam in tiny pools that appeared to be absorbed by the ship and never spread out. A shadow moved across the hallway behind me before I could think. I whirled around, the light trembling. There was a person present. It seems decades out of place to have a soldier in an outdated uniform. Unlike the crew of today, the navy coat was ripped, soaking through and stuck to him. His lips were tinted blue, and his complexion had the bloated, pale appearance of someone who has drowned. His eyes locked with mine as I stumbled back, muttering, "Oh my God." He suddenly growled, "Don't breathe alone tonight," in a voice like rushing water. I blinked, and he was gone. The dripping hatch was all that was left. The murmurs resurfaced in my cabin that night, louder and more urgent, reverberating throughout the walls. They weren't asking, though. This time, they held promise. "We're coming in," I said, and my cabin door's handle started to turn, as if someone or something were on the other side, frantically trying to get in. The door handle rattled and jerked harder with each movement. With my back to the wall, I pounded my heart, so forcefully that I thought the sound would reveal who I was. Like fog, the murmurs crept beneath the door. "Deck 0 waits. You opened the way, and we're already here." Suddenly, the handle stopped. The noise was not as bad as the silence. By dawn, I was at my breaking point. All of the shadows, whispers, and drowned figures I had encountered were rooted in whatever lay beneath that leaking hatch. I would never be able to get away from the nightmares if I didn't witness for myself. With my flashlight shaking in my hand and my camera running, I crept back into the restricted hallway. The hatch had the same appearance, wet, rust-streaked, and hummed softly. The padlock that had previously sealed it, however, was broken in two and was now on the ground. There was an open hatch I forcefully swallowed, opening it wide. The air that came out was harsh enough to sting my eyes and smelt of decay and salt. Water gleamed along the rungs of a small stairway that headed down into darkness. I had a gut feeling that I should go back. However, the murmurs drew me closer. I descended. There was a huge flooded room at the bottom. The walls didn't have the same polished metal as the rest of the ship. Instead, they appeared old and rusted, as though they had formerly been a part of a different ship. Nothing touched the frigid, rippling water that reached my knees. Then I caught sight of them. Floating just below the surface are figures with bloated, pale faces and hair that seems to be floating in invisible currents. Their eyes, which were dimly shining in the black sea, opened simultaneously. With the camera slipping in my hands, I staggered back. One of the bodies began to slowly rise at that point, shattering the surface. I had previously seen the same drowned cop. "You're sailing with us now," he said, his lips pulling back in a broken smile, flesh breaking at the seams as dozens of hands sprung out from the water, clutching at me. Heavy and chilly. I thrashed and yelled, but the more I struggled, the more they pulled me down. The flashlight died after flickering. My own reflection in the dark water, with 100 white faces staring back at me, was the last thing I captured on camera. My stateroom was deserted when the ship docked a few days later. Everything was gone, including my camera and possessions, as if I had never boarded at all. However, occasionally when new visitors stay in cabin 7C, they claim to hear me muttering, "Don't breathe alone tonight," right before they go to sleep.